بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. Today inshallah we'll cover the second lecture of the abdomen, and we'll do the gastrointestinal tract associated glands. The objectives of today's lecture is to describe the functional anatomy and features of the spleen, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, and biliary tree. And we also cover some important relations and the blood supply, nerve supply, and lymphatic drainage of these glands. We'll also cover the portal vein or the portal system of veins and how it is formed, and some of the clinical applications or clinical anatomy of the portal vein. We start with the spleen. So the spleen is the largest lymphoid tissue organ in the body. It's found in the left hypochondriac region of the abdominal cavity, and as you can see, so this is the lateral view of the abdominal cavity, where you see the spleen related to the 9th, 10th, and 11th ribs. The anterior border of the spleen usually does not cross the left mid-axillary line, so it's always behind it. This is a normal spleen. Normally it does not cross the left mid-axillary line. So for the description of the spleen, it has two borders, two surfaces, and two poles. The borders are these ones. So this is the anterior border, and that is the posterior border. So again, that's the anterior border, and this is the posterior border. Some textbooks, they describe them as the superior and inferior borders, but let's for in this lecture we follow the anterior and posterior borders. It has two poles, so this is the upper pole and that's the lower pole, and it has two surfaces. This is the surface which is facing medially. That surface, we call it the visceral surface because it's related to other viscera, and the other surface, which is this one, this is called the diaphragmatic surface. So two borders, two surfaces, and two poles. The peritoneal folds related to the spleen are the first of all, it's an intraperitoneal structure covered by the visceral peritoneum. So this is the visceral peritoneum covering the spleen. It has two ligaments, one of them connecting the spleen to the stomach, and we call it the gastrosplenic ligament, and the other one connecting the spleen to the kidney, and we call it splenorenal ligaments, and we call it also lenorenal ligament. So two ligaments and the visceral peritoneum, which covers the spleen, and that's why it's an intraperitoneal structure. Relations of the spleen and the impressions of those relations. So this is a posterior view, and as you can see, this is the spleen, the purple line, so that is the spleen, and as I described in the previous slides, it's related to the left 9th, 10th, and 11th ribs, and the long axis of the spleen corresponds with the 10th rib. So this is the 10th rib, which runs with the long axis of the spleen. So this is the posterior relations, and of course you can also put with the posterior relations is this is the diaphragm, and it's always posterior to the spleen, and that's why we call it the diaphragmatic surface. Another important relation also is this extension of the pleural cavity, and this is called the costodiaphragmatic recess. So it's always also posterior to the spleen. And of course, we can put the pleura also. So these are the posterior relations. Now the relations of the visceral surface are these structures. So this is the visceral surface, the one that you can see, and the three important or four important structures related to the visceral surface are the stomach. So now on this image the stomach is cut, so it's related to this part, and at the back there is the left kidney, so it should have an impression of the spleen, and the colic flexure, the left colic flexure, and towards the hilum of the spleen there is the tail of the pancreas. So those are the relations on the visceral surface, and each of these relations will produce an impression. So this is the gastric impression, which is related to the stomach, and this is the renal impression related to the left kidney, and this is the colic impression related to the left colic flexure, and towards the hilum there should be the impression of the tail of the pancreas. So gastric, colic, renal, and then the position of the tail of the pancreas in this area, and that's the impression produced by it. Blood supply of the spleen. Now spleen is supplied by the branches of the celiac artery. So this is the celiac artery. One of the main branches of the celiac artery is the splenic artery, and this is the artery that will supply the spleen. So the artery runs on the upper border of the pancreas, and there it reaches the hilum of the spleen. The spleen is drained by a big artery, and we call it the splenic artery. So this is the splenic artery related posteriorly to the pancreas, and the splenic artery eventually will join the splenic vein related to the posterior surface of the pancreas eventually will join the portal vein, the superior mesenteric vein, and both will form the portal vein. You should also remember from a previous slide that the splenic vein also drains part of the stomach through the short gastric veins, and the left gastroepiploic vein. It also drains the pancreas through the pancreatic veins. So splenic artery and splenic vein. The lymphatics will follow the arteries, so all of the lymphatics coming from the spleen will follow the splenic artery until it reaches the celiac lymph nodes around the celiac artery. The nerve supply of the spleen comes from the celiac plexus around the celiac artery, and then the branches of this plexus will follow the splenic artery until they reach the spleen. And the celiac plexus is an autonomic plexus composed of sympathetic and parasympathetic. The parasympathetic come from the vagus nerve. The sympathetic comes from the sympathetic chain. So branches from the sympathetic chain will reach the celiac plexus, and then they will run through with the celiac artery with the splenic artery to reach the spleen. Now, don't worry about the details of a ganglion and trunk, but just focus on the celiac plexus. Now we'll move to the pancreas. So this is an image of the abdominal cavity, and that's yellow structure represents the pancreas. So it's a mixed gland, exocrine and endocrine. Exocrine because it secretes the digestive enzymes into the gastrointestinal tract through ducts, and endocrine because it secretes hormones, the insulin and the glucagon. It's found in the epigastric and left hypochondriac regions of the abdominal cavity, and usually the transpyloric plane runs through the neck of the pancreas, and that's why usually the head is below the transpyloric plane and the body and the tail is above the transpyloric plane. So this is usually the transpyloric plane runs through the neck of the pancreas. The spleen is retroperitoneal except the tail or part of the tail, which is found within the two layers of the splenorenal or lienorenal ligament. So only this part is intraperitoneal, the rest is retroperitoneal. The relations of the spleen, of the pancreas. So that's the pancreas. First, let's start with the parts of the pancreas. It has the head and the neck, and then the body and the tail. Each of these parts of the pancreas, they have some important relations. Let's start with the head. So that's the head. It's found within the concavity of the duodenum, and the important relations of the head of the pancreas includes the common bile duct. So the common bile ducts runs through a groove on the posterior surface of the head of the pancreas. So it's also where the common bile duct meets the main pancreatic duct, forming the pancreatico-duodenal ampulla, or the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Hepatopancreatic ampulla. So this is the main relations of the head of the pancreas. Also, you can put the inferior vena cava. So inferior vena cava also related posteriorly to the head of the pancreas. The uncinate process is this extension of the head of the pancreas that passes posterior to the superior mesenteric vein and superior mesenteric artery. So the superior mesenteric veins and artery are related anteriorly to the uncinate process. If we move laterally to the neck, now the most important relation of the neck is the portal vein. So the portal vein, which is formed by the union of the splenic vein and superior mesenteric vein, it's formed posterior to the neck of the pancreas. If we move laterally to the body is related to the abdominal aorta, and as you remember from a previous slide, the splenic vein runs posterior to the body. The splenic artery runs superior on the superior border of the pancreas, or superior to the body of the pancreas. And if you move more laterally, now you will see the left kidney. So the left kidney posterior to the pancreas, to the body of the pancreas. And if you reach the tail is found in the lienorenal or splenorenal ligaments towards the hilum of the spleen. So these are the most important relations of the parts of the pancreas. Now, anteriorly, the pancreas is so it's posterior to the lesser sac, and the transverse mesocolon also found anterior to the pancreas. Blood supply of the pancreas. So the pancreas is supplied by branches of both the celiac artery and the superior mesenteric artery. So we have superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, which is a branch of the gastro-duodenal artery. So there is the superior pancreatico-duodenal arteries, and there is an inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery. Each of them has an anterior and a posterior part. So there is an anterior pancreatico-duodenal branch and a posterior pancreatico-duodenal branch. So for the simplicity, you just need to know that there is a superior pancreatico-duodenal artery, which is coming from the celiac artery, and there is an inferior pancreatico-duodenal artery which is coming from the superior mesenteric artery. There is also the pancreatic branches of the splenic artery. So splenic artery also gives pancreatic branches. Regarding the veins, so it's the corresponding vein. So we have superior pancreatico-duodenal vein and inferior pancreatico-duodenal veins, which both drain into the superior mesenteric vein. We also have the pancreatic veins, which drain into the splenic vein. Eventually, all the drainage of, or the venous drainage from the pancreas drains into the portal vein, either through the superior mesenteric vein or through the splenic vein. The nerve supply of the pancreas. Now, because the pancreas gets its blood supply from both celiac and superior mesenteric arteries. So both the celiac and superior mesenteric plexuses supply the autonomic nervous supply to the pancreas. And again, the parasympathetic comes from the vagus, while the sympathetic comes from the sympathetic chain. So in comparison to the spleen, which is only supplied by the celiac plexus, the pancreas supply is supplied by both the celiac and superior mesenteric plexus. Likewise, the lymphatic drainage of the pancreas eventually goes to the celiac lymph nodes around the celiac artery, but part of it goes to the superior mesenteric lymph nodes around the superior mesenteric artery. So because it has dual blood supplies, now the nerve and the lymphatics follow the arteries of the blood supplies to the celiac lymph nodes and superior mesenteric lymph nodes when talking about the lymph, and to the celiac plexus and superior mesenteric plexus when talking about the nerve supply, the autonomic nerve supply. So you can notice that it is similar to the duodenum, because duodenum also has this dual blood supply, and it has a similar distribution of nerve supply and lymphatic drainage. Now let's move to the liver. So the liver, it's the largest gland in our body. It spreads over 3 regions of the abdomen, and that includes the right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, and the left hydrochondriac region. It's found below the diaphragm, and it's an intraperitoneal structure, except few parts that will be mentioned in next slides. Now this is the liver, and this is the visceral peritoneum covering the liver, and as you can see, there is some area of the liver which is retroperitoneal. It's not intraperitoneal. It's not covered by the visceral peritoneum. There are some recesses or spaces that we call them recesses. So a recess is just part of the peritoneal cavity. It's like an extension of the peritoneal cavity around the liver, and one of the recesses is this recess, which is called the subphrenic, because it's just below the diaphragm. So this is called the subphrenic recess. And there is also a subhepatic recess, which is this one just below the liver. And there is also a hepatorenal recess, a deeper one, this one. So it's between the liver and the right kidney, and this is called the hepatorenal recess or the hepatorenal pouch. Now the hepatorenal pouch is important clinically because it's, while the patient is lying down, it's actually the deepest point of the peritoneal cavity. So in a supine position, the deepest point of the peritoneal cavity is this, and that's the hepatorenal recess or hepatorenal pouch. And this is important because usually fluid or blood in the peritoneal cavity usually collects in this recess in a supine position. The ligaments of the liver. So liver is an intraperitoneal structure, so you find folds of peritoneum connecting the liver to the or connecting the visceral peritoneum on the surface of the liver to the parietal peritoneum lining the peritoneal cavity, mostly the diaphragmatic surface of the peritoneal cavity. Now, what are those ligaments? Now, let's start anteriorly. So, anteriorly, we have the falciform ligament, which divides the right and the left lobes anteriorly, and we have the coronary ligament, which connects the upper surface of the liver to the lower surface of the diaphragm. So that's the coronary ligament. Now this is another view where you see the coronary ligament, which has two layers. So this is this is a posterior view on this image. This is a posterior view of the liver, and this one is an anterior view of the liver. So let's focus on this one. Now this is the coronary ligament. The one that you see over there is the right layer of the coronary ligament, which is this one. So this is a right layer of the coronary ligament, and this is the so this is the anterior layer of the coronary ligament, and this is the posterior layer of the coronary ligament. We also have triangular ligaments. There is one on the right side, so this is the right triangular ligament, and there is one on the left side. This is the left triangular ligament. So if you just follow the coronary ligament, so if you start from there, you start with the right triangular ligament, and then the anterior layer of the coronary ligament, and then you reach the left triangular ligament, and then you continue with the posterior layer of the coronary ligament. And this area, which is bounded by the coronary ligament, is retroperitoneal. It's not covered by visceral peritoneum, and this area is called the bare area. There are also other ligaments, and these ligaments, one of them is the round ligament, or the ligamentum teres, which is a remnant of the umbilical veins. This connects the liver to the umbilicus. And there is also the ligamentum venosum. In the fetus, this was like a venous duct called ductus venosus, because blood, when it comes from the umbilicus in the fetus, it does not have to go through the liver. It gets shunted directly to the inferior vena cava through the ductus venosus. After birth, this ductus venosus gets obliterated and it transforms into a ligament, and the ligament is called ligamentum venosum. So ligamentum venosum and the round ligament, or ligamentum teres, these are developmental ligaments. They were veins or ducts in the fetus. After birth, they get closed, obliterated, and become ligaments. So I also mentioned that most of the liver is intraperitoneal, covered by the visceral peritoneum, except few areas. One of them is the bare area. I've already mentioned it. And the other areas is this. So this area is called the porta hepatis. It's like the hilum of the liver, or the gate to the liver, where structures enter or come out. So porta hepatis is not covered by visceral peritoneum. The third area is where the gallbladder is attached to the visceral surface of the liver, and the fourth one is where the inferior vena cava is attached to the liver. So these are 4 retroperitoneal areas, including the bare area, attachment, the place of attachment of the inferior vena cava, the porta hepatis, and the place of attachment of the gallbladder. The rest is covered by visceral peritoneum. Now this is another image showing you the different ligaments, and this is important because now you can see in the previous slide I told you that the coronary ligament attaches the liver to the lower surface of the diaphragm. Now this is the diaphragm, and this is the lower surface of the diaphragm, and this is where the coronary ligament is found, and it's a peritoneal fold connecting the visceral peritoneum on the surface of the liver with the parietal peritoneum on the surface of the diaphragm, the lower surface of the diaphragm, and that's the coronary ligament. The liver is divided into lobes, and those now you have in the previous slide you have seen the ligaments. Now these ligaments, they divide the liver into lobes. So the falciform ligament anteriorly divides the liver into a bigger right lobe and a smaller left lobe. If you go to the visceral surface of the liver, now you see 2 additional lobes. So there is a further division of the right lobe into two smaller lobes. So two smaller lobes you can find posteriorly. There is the caudate lobe superiorly and the quadrate lobe inferiorly. Now the caudate lobe has also a papillary process, and because of this, the presence of the papillary process, which looks like the tail, accordingly the lobe is called the caudate lobe. So these are the anatomical lobes. If you have an anterior view, you will only see the right and left. If you have an inferior or a posterior view where you see the visceral surface of the liver, you will have 4 lobes, and that includes the right lobe, left lobe, caudate lobe, and the quadrate lobe. Relations and impressions on the visceral surface of the liver. Now, for simplicity, I will now the liver has 2 surfaces: one the diaphragmatic surface and the visceral surface. Some textbooks will go further and mention other surfaces like superior surface, anterior surface, right surface, and posterior-inferior surface. But I will just mention in this lecture the diaphragmatic surface and the visceral surface. And this is the visceral surface of the liver, and on this surface you can see the liver is related to many structures, and these structures, they have their own impressions on the visceral surface of the liver. Now, in order to understand this, I will start with this image. Now, this is the location where you find the liver. So the liver is sitting over there and extending like this. And these are the structures found posterior to the liver, and they should be related to the visceral surface of the liver. So what are those structures? There is the stomach, including the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. So those should have impressions on the liver, and also the first part of the duodenum over there. We also have the right kidney and the right suprarenal gland. We also have the right colic flexure, where the ascending colon turns and becomes the transverse colon. So there should be also an impression for the colic flexure and part of the transverse colon on the visceral surface of the liver. There is the there is the esophagus, end of esophagus, and there is the diaphragm. So we should be able to see impressions of all these structures on the visceral surface of the liver. Now, this is the left lobe, where there is the gastric impression. So the stomach is found like this. So this is the body, the fundus, the body, and then the pylorus, and that should be the duodenum. So duodenum is there. So stomach, gastric area, the pyloric area, and the duodenal area. This one, it's not highlighted, but it's one of the impressions. Okay. Now also be careful that this is a posterior view, so you will see the left side on this side, but it's not on this side. This is right, and this is left. On the liver, this is left, and this is right. So stomach, pylorus, and duodenum. This is the impression of the right kidney, and that's the impression of the right suprarenal gland. So kidney and suprarenal gland. Esophagus should be close to the stomach, so that's the esophageal area. And this is the diaphragmatic area, which is this one, where the diaphragm is related to the liver. And on the right side, this is the area of the colon, the colic area, including the right colic flexure and then the transverse colon, which is this one. Now, if you want to work this out, first have a look at this image and see what structures are posterior to the liver or posterior inferior to the liver, and then have a look at this one and try to trace all of these structures on the visceral surface of the liver. In the previous slide, I talked about anatomical lobes, but we also have physiological or functional lobes. And now this is physiological and functional lobes are divided according to the branching of the portal triad, including the portal vein, the hepatic artery, and the division of the biliary system. So there is a line anteriorly. Now, when we talk about anatomical lobe, the division anteriorly is the falciform ligament. When we come to the physiological lobe, the division line or dividing line moves a little bit to the right, and this is called the Cantley line. It passes, it's a line that passes from the fundus of the gallbladder to the inferior vena cava. So this is the line that divides the liver anteriorly into a right and a left physiological lobes. If you go posteriorly, this is the same line that passes through the gallbladder until it reaches the inferior vena cava, but it shifts a little bit to the left in the caudate lobe. So this is the line that divides the liver posteriorly into a right and left physiological lobes. And this line is called the right sagittal fissure, because we also have the left sagittal fissure that includes the, you remember these ligaments, the ligamentum teres and the ligamentum venosus. So this is the left sagittal fissure, and the right sagittal fissure is the one that runs through the gallbladder and the inferior vena cava. So these are physiological lobes, and then as you can see, these lobes will be divided later into divisions and segments, but don't worry about these details. You will cover them later, inshallah, next year when you do the elementary system. Now, when we come to the lymphatic drainage and nerve supply to the liver, the lymphatics is drained into mainly drained into the celiac lymph nodes, because again, following the artery, it will end into the celiac lymph nodes. But there is some lymph will reach the mediastinal lymph nodes through the bare area of the liver, which eventually those lymphatic channels will end into the mediastinal lymph nodes in the thorax. So mostly in the celiac lymph nodes, but some will drain into the mediastinal lymph nodes. When we come to the nerve supply, autonomic nerve supply, again, it's from the celiac plexus. The autonomic plexus that supplies the liver and the gallbladder, it's the celiac plexus, and the parasympathetic comes from the vagus, sympathetic comes from the sympathetic chain. Now we come to the gallbladder. So gallbladder, it's a sac which is responsible of receiving the bile that's produced by the liver, and then in the gallbladder it gets stored and concentrated, and later bile is secreted from the concentrated bile is secreted from the gallbladder to the through the biliary system until it reaches the duodenum. So it's found in just below you have seen it in the previous slide when we talked about the liver. So it's found in the just on the visceral surface of the liver, but the fundus is protruding, and that's why the fundus of the gallbladder is encirculated by the visceral peritoneum, while the rest of it is just covered by the posteriorly or posterior-inferiorly by the visceral peritoneum. So this is covered by visceral peritoneum. The fundus, it's like encirculated by the visceral peritoneum. The fundus of the gallbladder is always found at the level of the ninth costal cartilage. So this is the 10th rib, this is the 9th rib, this is the 9th costal cartilage, and the fundus of the gallbladder corresponds with the right 9th costal cartilage. The parts of the gallbladder includes the fundus, the body, and the neck, and then from the neck there is a cystic duct that conveys the bile into the common bile duct. Relations of the gallbladder. So this is the gallbladder. Anteriorly it's related, or anterior-superiorly it's related to the visceral surface of the liver, but it's also related anteriorly to the anterior abdominal wall. So this is the anterior abdominal wall. It's anterior to the fundus of the gallbladder. The body and the neck, they are related to the visceral surface of the liver. Posterior-inferiorly, there are two important relations, and that includes this and that. So it's the duodenum and the transverse colon. So this is the duodenum, and that's the transverse colon. They are related to the gallbladder posteriorly and inferiorly. And this has an important clinical application that you will see in the next slides, inshallah. When we talk about the gallbladder, we should also talk about the biliary system. The biliary system, or the biliary tree, this is the tree or system of ducts that eventually will convey the bile from the liver into the second part of the duodenum. Now this starts with the hepatic ducts. So there is a left hepatic duct draining bile from the left physiological lobe, and the right hepatic duct draining duct from the right physiological lobe. So right and left hepatic ducts will join and form common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct will be joined later by the cystic duct, the duct of the gallbladder, and they will form the common bile duct. The common bile duct will descend posterior to the head of the pancreas, and it will meet the main pancreatic duct, and they will form the hepatopancreatic ampulla of Vater, and this ampulla will open into the second part of the duodenum through the major duodenal papilla. So this is the biliary tree, in all parts of the biliary tree. Now there is also sphincters. This image is an enlarged image of this location, where you see the second part of the duodenum. That's the major duodenal papilla, where the hepatopancreatic ampulla of Vater drains, and this ampulla has a sphincter, smooth muscle sphincter, and this sphincter is called the sphincter of hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the sphincter of OD. So this is a sphincter that relaxes when the bile comes through the common hepatic duct and drains it into the second part of the duodenum. Now each of these two ducts, the common bile duct and the pancreatic main pancreatic duct, has its own sphincter controlling the secretions. So these sphincters, they relax when the secretions of the coming through the bile duct or the main pancreatic duct comes, and then secretion reaches the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So three sphincters, and the sphincter of the ampulla is called the sphincter of OD, according to the anatomist who discovered it first. Gallbladder blood supply. So there is a cystic artery. So gallbladder is supplied by a small artery. We call it the cystic artery, and it is drained by a vein that is called a cystic vein. Now the artery is a branch of the right hepatic artery. So this is the hepatic artery, which is a branch of the common hepatic artery. If we start from the celiac, one of the branches of the celiac is the common hepatic artery. One of the branches of the common hepatic artery is the hepatic artery, or the hepatic artery proper, or proper hepatic artery. Now this artery will divide into a right and left hepatic arteries. The right hepatic artery usually gives a branch that will supply the gallbladder, and this branch is called the cystic artery. Now the cystic artery usually comes from the right hepatic artery, but there is some variation. Sometimes it comes from the common hepatic, sometimes it comes from the gastroduodenal. So the surgeons, when they are doing an operation in this area, they want to ligate the ducts, they should be careful and be aware of these variations in order to avoid ligating the wrong structure. The cystic vein usually drains in the right branch of the portal vein. The lymphatic drainage and nerve supply of the gallbladder. So the lymphatic drainage will eventually drain into the celiac lymph nodes. So, and the nerve supply comes from the celiac ganglion. So the celiac ganglion, from the celiac plexus, sorry, the nerve supply comes from the celiac plexus, and which includes sympathetic, parasympathetic through the vagus, and sympathetic through the sympathetic chain. The last part of this lecture is to talk about the portal vein. I already mentioned it in the previous slides how it is formed, but the portal vein it's a system, or the portal system of veins. It's a system that drains the nutrient-rich blood from the gastrointestinal tract to the liver. So blood which is venous blood, which includes the absorbed nutrients from the intestine, do not directly go into the inferior vena cava and then into the systemic circulation, but they move through the liver, and to reach the liver there is a portal vein. So this is the portal vein that will take the venous return from gastrointestinal tract, starting from the lower end of the esophagus to the upper third of rectum, blood will be drained from these parts into the portal vein. So that's the function of the portal vein. Then the blood, when it reaches the liver, nutrients might be stored. Some of the nutrients might be transported, packaged, and transported to other parts of the body. But this is the why do we need the portal vein and its tributaries. So that's the function. What structure form it? So this is the beginning of the portal vein, and that's the end of the portal vein. So it starts just behind the neck of the pancreas by the union of the splenic vein and the superior mesenteric vein, and then it goes up in the free margin, right free margin of the lesser omentum until it reaches the porta hepatis, where it divides into right and left branches. Now there is this splenic vein meets the superior mesenteric vein and form the portal vein. There is also an inferior mesenteric vein that drains the parts of the hindgut, but this inferior mesenteric vein will drain first into the will join first the splenic vein, and then the splenic vein will join the superior mesenteric and form the portal vein. As you can see, there are a lot of tributaries draining into the portal vein apart from the superior mesenteric and splenic veins. And this slides covers the different tributaries. Now we have different types of tributaries. Formative tributaries. Now tributaries means rawafid, those small veins that will drain into the bigger vein, which is the portal vein. Formative tributaries are the tributaries that form the portal vein, and that includes the splenic and superior mesenteric. There are veins draining into the trunk of the portal vein, and these veins are the right and left gastric veins. So this is the right gastric vein and the left gastric veins. They drain directly into the trunk of the portal vein. There are veins that drain into the branches of the portal vein. So this is the portal vein. It will have a right branch and a left branch. So the right branch, the cystic vein, drains into the right branch of the portal vein. You already seen this in the gallbladder blood supply. The left branch drains the para-umbilical veins. So these are the para-umbilical veins draining, coming from the umbilicus through the ligamentum teres until they reach the left branch of the portal vein. Now we also have the sites of portosystemic anastomosis. So sites of portosystemic anastomosis are the sites where a structure is drained by veins that will join the portal system and some veins that will drain and join the systemic venous circulation. We already covered the lower part or lower end of the esophagus. So lower end of esophagus, so part of the esophagus is drained by veins that will join the azygous system, but the left gastric will drain into the portal vein. So lower end of esophagus is a site of portosystemic anastomosis. Second part is the rectum. So the rectum has three veins: a superior rectal vein, a middle rectal vein, and an inferior rectal vein. The superior rectal vein drains into the inferior mesenteric vein, while the middle and the inferior rectal vein will drain into eventually into the internal iliac vein. So that's a systemic vein. The third location is around the umbilicus. So the umbilicus, some of the veins drain into the systemic veins, and the para-umbilical veins will drain into the portal system, exactly in the left branch of para-umbilical vein. The fourth site is at the posterior abdominal wall in the retroperitoneal structures of the gastrointestinal tracts, like the ascending colon and the descending colon. So there are the veins draining the nutrients from the descending colon, for example, drain into the portal vein, while there are also other veins that will drain into the eventually into the inferior vena cava. So there is another site of portosystemic anastomosis. There is also inside the liver. Some of the blood goes into the portal vein, but there are some veins that will pierce the diaphragm out of the bare area and then drain into the inferior vena cava. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these are sites of portosystemic anastomosis, where there is a connection between the systemic venous blood and portal venous system. Now this is important. This becomes important if there is a problem in the liver that will cause portal hypertension. So blood which is drained through the portal vein is not able to pass through the liver, and this condition is called the portal hypertension. So there's a high pressure into the portal vein. Eventually the blood is not able to pass through the portal vein, and it will accumulate in those sites of portosystemic anastomosis, leading to dilatation of those veins. And there are certain conditions that can occur in some of these sites of portosystemic anastomosis that will be covered in the next slide. So these are the conditions that can result from the portal hypertension. One of them is the esophageal varices. We already covered in the last lecture. If there is a portal hypertension, so there is also congestion, dilatation of the veins in the towards the end of the rectum in the anal canal, and this condition is called hemorrhoids or piles. Now don't worry about internal and external, but you need to know that hemorrhoids is one of the conditions that result from portal hypertension in the anal canal. If those veins around the umbilicus get congested, the resulting condition is called the capota medosa. So this is the condition where the veins on the anterior abdominal wall around the umbilicus get congested, dilated, tortuous, and this condition is called the capota medosa. Now there is another condition that can also happen due to portal hypertension, although there is no site of portosystemic anastomosis in the spleen, but because it's drained by the splenic vein, which drains into the portal vein, so blood also gets accumulating into the spleen, and consequently the spleen will get enlarged, and this condition is called congestive splenomegaly. So these are 4 conditions that can occur due to the portal hypertension, which is increased pressure in the portal venous system. So this ends the today's lecture, and inshallah in the next lecture we'll cover what remained from the last lecture. That's the rest of the small intestine and the large intestine, and with that we'll finish the abdominal component of the structure function relationship course. Thank you again, and please, if you have any questions, you can email them to me and I will be happy to respond to your questions. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.